Hello everyone, today we talk about Constantine the Seventh, known as the Porphyrogenitus, albeit, as you know, that was a pretty standard title for anyone born in the Porphyra, and Romanos the First, Lekapenos, or Lekapenos, or Lekapenos. Every Byzantinist will tell you that they have no idea, frankly, where the accent plays. I think it's actually Lekapenos, but anyhow, I usually said Lekapenos. In any case, it's not a big deal, right? If Byzantinists at university can tell you this, you're safe. We're not sounding like a moron by mispronouncing it. However, that's a very intense part of the Macedonian era, right? With here a Macedonian emperor, and one of the three usurpers of this phase, as we will see, was actually a quite an expansionistic one, a great coming back of the empire that scored remarkable success, especially in the east, and that in spite, as we will see now, of some, of course, back and forths that are a bit normal in any kind of medieval situation, an important continuity, right? And again, in spite also of the ambiguity of the the usurpations that coexisted with still the Macedonian bloodline, etc. So we start actually with Alexander, brother of Leo VI, ruling between 912 and 913. He had been formerly co-emperor with Leo VI, and he stepped in when his brother died, but together did little Constantine, also the son of Leo VI, and his latest wife, Zoe Carbonospina. Alexander essentially overthrew his brother's policy, right, towards whom was animated by a deep grudge. There had been especially an issue, so-called of the tetragamy, because Leo VI, actually because he remained widowed all the time, married for four times, right? And according to the Byzantine tradition, even the third marriage would have been illegal, right? And even if your wives died twice in a row, you couldn't remarry, right? And not only Leo VI had married for a third time, but also for a fourth one. And at that point, the Patriarch of Constantinople, Nicholas Mysticus, had staunchly opposed the emperor. That reason, of course, this was connected with some kind of autonomistic, say, aims of the same patriarchal see that, as you know, had always remained subjected to imperial will, differently from the West. But in this re-expansionistic phase, there was still revival of some patriarchal ambition. And this matter was serious because, of course, in the Byzantine Empire, everything was very much regulated according to some forms that were deemed, generally speaking, to be mutable. Naturally, everything changed as everywhere, but much more gradually. And the powers, the leaders in charge, were always extremely, eager to highlight some kind of orthodoxy going on in the process. Consider that the emperor had gone past this problem by obtaining a papal dispensation, because in the West marriage issues were more lax. At least it's not that there was any moral issue behind this in a personal sense, right? Leo VI had done nothing, say, morally reprehensible in a behavioral way, right? It was just about how many marriages were tolerated in that sense, and the papacy said, well, okay, yes, and the way they justified this was that even though there was a regulation against even the third marriage, there was a general economy for which the bishops could dispensate from the observance of some rules in exchange for the sake of the salvation of the souls, fundamentally. So, actually a more open-minded and flexible and practically functional way of reasoning, given again that the thing was. But of course, the problem had caused enormous issues, and we will see it when we will talk about Leo VI in greater detail. But to make the long story short, Alexander essentially sent away his brother's widow from the imperial palace, right? Because naturally Zoe there had an interest in the mechanism, and in order to be legitimized, etc. And he called back on the throne the Patriarch Nicholas Mysticus, naturally the patriarchal throne. However, Alexander's sudden, early death created a further power vacuum because of the minority of Constantine the Seventh, which brought, as it was, say, common Constantinople, to violent factional clashes for the conquest of the throne. That was a much bigger issue, given that the Byzantine Empire, as it was emerging from the early Middle Ages, was fundamentally Constantinople. It was ruled by from the city and only from that, and so everybody was seizing the opportunity of even just a minority of a legitimate sovereign and heir to the empire as a good chance to take over control of the city. So when Constantine became nominally emperor, as it was normal, he was only 7 years old, and the power was exercised on his behalf by a regency council headed by the Patriarch Nicholas Mysticus. And against the latter, through the little sovereign, a loyalist faction headed by his mother, Empress Zoe, was constituted. And the Patriarch at that point obliged Zoe to enter a monastery, which was quite common also, right, to take out a political opponent without killing her. In this case, eventually they could be killed in a shady way. Right? They were in the monastery, but at least formally, right? It was a way of saying, I was wrong, I repented for my sins, and so on, publicly. Then, of course, these things were always forced, and there were ways also that we will see very often, taking out eyes and other niceries. But in any case, Zoe up to that point had managed to come back to the palace, and she was sent away again. And the authority of Nicholas Mysticus was, however, further opposed by a same ecclesiastical party that had instead remained faithful to the previous Patriarch Euthymius, that Leo VI had used in order to after he had overthrown Mysticus, to officiate even the fourth marriage, maintaining the legitimacy even of his third. And the same Euthymius had in turn been brutally deposed by Alexander. So in this political and dynastic difficulties, in 1913, the domesticos of the Scholai, Constantine Ducas, had attempted to take over the throne. Right, the domesticos of the Scholai, in this sense, had become the supreme commander of the army. He controlled the palace troops, right, and so this is a further example of how many, in such a complex system, how many ways there were to exercise power from different directions. Support naturally of the people. Constantinople was a massive city, and there were many forces that could be mobilized, not just strictly the military ones. In fact, after this failed attempt, actually, the same Patriarch Nicholas Mysticus carried out a bloody reprisal that shows how powerful, by the way, the Constantinopolitan Patriarch had become. So this situation doesn't inspire particular political cohesion or stability, which is something that the Bulgarians noticed. As you know, the Bulgarian Empire at this point had importantly developed. It was always this Damocles sword just next door to Constantinople, trying essentially to become not properly, a Roman Empire, but to substitute themselves to it. And so in these situations, the political leverage that the Bulgars could make on Constantinople increased dramatically. The Bulgarian ruler Simeon profited of such imperial internal weakness in order to seize Constantinople. That would have been naturally for many peoples that fundamentally wouldn't make it until the Crusaders in the Fourth Crusade and the Ottomans in 1453 to storm the city. It was massively defended. It was, as you know, infrastructurally with the Theodosian walls, with the dramatic geographical location, etc. Fundamentally impregnable in many ways. But it was not the point, because as Clausewitzians we know that war is just a continuation of politics with other means. And so the point by besieging Constantinople, as we will see now, was just to exert an important political pressure internally and to obtain thus something in the way. In fact, aside from this initial difficulties, after Leo VI's death, it was his brother Alexander to have had refused to continue paying to Simeon the tribute granted by his brother, and in 913 the Bulgarian sovereign attacked by reprisal the Byzantine territory besieging Constantinople. So also in virtue of that initial break of the previous agreements. So this Bulgarian aggression was very different from the ones that in fact these northern neighbors had waged on Constantinople before, right? It was still brutal in many ways, but Simeon, Tsar of Bulgaria, had been educated, been nurtured within Byzantine culture. He had really gone beyond qualitatively compared to the previous Bulgarian era, right? So he had much more political, cultural understanding and also connections and vision than his predecessors. And he wouldn't aim to destroy the city like, a steppe ruler at that point. Again, the Bulgars had really diluted in the Slavic majority, and those were lands that had already belonged to the empire historically and so on. So, of course, razing Constantinople to the ground, first of all, it would have not been feasible, and it would have been silly in the first place. But he just wanted rather to profit of the dynastic crisis to constitute, we can say in his person, a sort of new Byzantine Bulgarian empire, right? And nothing in any way could have done at that point against the walls of the capital. Right? The Bulgarian army didn't have the means at least in that circumstance. Of course, you could have done it because of that internal pressure. And that's exactly what happened, and what also Simeon had to content himself of achieving, which was extraordinary. That is to say, the Byzantine government capitulated equally towards the enemies, and Simeon entered in a negotiate with the regents of Constantine by obtaining great concessions. For example, the payment of the tribute arrears, the promise of having one of his daughters married to the same Constantine, and the crown of Basileus of the Bulgarians. That would be the equivalent, practically, of the Byzantine imperial title. You know that fundamentally Basileus is a bit a different title from the original imperator or other titles that had stressed much more the kind of the universality of the site. But that's how also the Byzantines had come to call their monarchs like, and that very meaning in their culture, that, as you know, is very hypostatic, categorical, right, and crystallized in that way, equated also in the relation, especially when recognized by themselves, in the twin title to the Bulgarians, to exactly a projection of that same power, a recognition to the Bulgarians of the same. So ideologically, this was a radically powerful weapon that Simeon could use, also not just much against the Byzantines, but that he hoped to hegemonize some way, but within Bulgaria, which was actually the most important issue there. In fact, he received the same crown of Basileus by the hands of Nicholas Mysticus, right? So, just in perspective, Nicholas Mysticus bitches about, no, the Roman Emperor cannot be married for a third time or a fourth time, but I will, crown the Bulgarian sovereign as Basileus, with my own hands. Well, everything's normal, right? So that tells you how bent and wicked some dynamics can be politically, but that's also history in a way. So satisfied by the results achieved, Simeon, that was still besieging Constantinople, abandoned the operation without, however, let's say that we can excuse him in that sense, being able to predict the surprises that the instability of the same Byzantine government could reserve, as if that show had not been enough. But he got what he wanted, so it was the thing. And after his departure, in fact, there was a coup in Constantinople at the beginning of the next year, 914, that had power passing once again back to Zoe, who rejected also the terms of the agreement with the Bulgarians. And Simeon was disappointed his new regency expectancies, because that's what he wanted to achieve fundamentally. And we'll see how Romanos I practically did the same thing by having his daughter married to Constantine, so he could become the father of the emperor. More of that later. But everybody playing essentially with Constantine the Seventh minority, and would that could be used to control the city, and also they are establishing a dynastic continuity, because of course if you gave your daughter in marriage to the emperor, you automatically became part of the imperial family by some degree, right? Naturally, it was different in terms of being a Bulgarian Tsar, a Byzantine admiral, as we'll see, but still. And of course, by the way, at that time, Simeon was aware of Zoe's hostility, right? For which he attacked again the imperial territory, and this is in a more conventional way compared to the usual, that he's devastating it for years, and even inflicting two heavy defeats in open field to the Byzantine army, right? So besieging Constantinople was a big thing at that point. He had been prepared to it, but normally, as we have often explained, looking at the Balkans during the Byzantine era and all the various populations of the north, how they intervened, it was about raiding almost unopposed, at least at some levels. True, even just giving green light to all the various clans of your people, is still kind of tribal realities, etc., relatively decentralized power, at least one lacking a true central core, like the Byzantine one, creating all those valleys running through, the latitude up to the Aegean Sea, the Ionian Sea, etc., and even up to Greece, right? So looting, pillaging, and those were very difficult to counter by the imperial forces, because normally the Byzantines had, of course, a strategic advantage as a professional permanent army, but they were designed in that sense to just counter the major threats. So these ones were kind of course, strategically relevant, but on the long run, they also costed a lot, traditionally speaking. So it was really complicated. It favored also that aforementioned progress of decline of the province in favor of Constantinople, by the way, etc. Because the idea was severing them from the city to gain even some further foothold in imperial territory. And at this point, as you understand, the Byzantine regency wasn't quite effective. Constantinople was defeated, as we've seen in battle. It was not able to react in an adequate way, which is also kind of understandable given the circumstances. They tried, right? But the situation changed again when in 919, among the various claimants to the imperial throne, the commander of the imperial fleet, Romanos, Lekapenos, imposed himself, right? He managed, so this is a strong officer and a quite relevant figure in the Byzantine military. He managed to become regent, right? He immediately inverted that yielding policy that the Byzantine had either to maintain in foreign relations, and he took the reins of the state. Simeon of Bulgaria, consequently, however, didn't back down, but accentuated the military pressure on the empire. In 924, he reappeared under the Theodosian walls again, and the attempts to seize Constantinople, however, military, once again crushed against the solidity of its defenses, and to the military failure of the Bulgarians was added the ability of imperial diplomacy that rendered vain the let's say Simeon's attempt of alliance with the Arabs of Egypt in anti-Byzantine function. In 924, thus, Simeon was forced to negotiate with Romanos Lekapenos, and in 927, the conflict was finally resolved by the death of the same Bulgarian Tsar, whose successor concluded a peace with Constantinople, obtaining some recognitions and the hand of Mary, also, if I'm not wrong, known as Helen, if I'm not wrong, a niece of Romanos Lekapenos. Sometimes you have different names of the same people, actually, as they change when they enter another court, etc., but not all. Now, Romanos I Lekapenos ruled as the first of the three usurpers of the Macedonian era between 920 and 944. And the characteristic of the Macedonian usurpations is to have maintained on the throne the legitimate sovereigns, even by still depriving them of any power, in homage to a dynastic loyalism that it had particularly reinforced within the population. This was something, say, typical since it had gone steadily increasing since properly, the birth of the empire in a way. The oligarchs had fundamentally been granted some power by the monarch, but fundamentally the people had stood to his side exactly to counter the power of the former, that were the main threat to the kind of public statal culture that the Byzantine Empire had been working on. And more of this later, when we will see also what kind of, in fact, what kind of reforms the same Romanos would enact in order to stem aristocratic power and the dissolution of the peasant military men, let's say, as the backbone of imperial power, in a sense, even though it's still kind of a romantic ideal. The Macedonian era is the last one in which the trend could be reversed, right? When the Komnenoi stepped in after also a phase of great distress of the empire, the situation had degenerated to the point that it was better at that point to rather develop some kind of more privatistic, quasi-feudal system rather than the other way around. But they tried. As you know, we made videos also about Basil II, etc., so explaining what the issue was. And this time was important because, you know, that the 10th century, even though it was a quite military era, and that quite contributed also to the kind of erosion of the middle class, was at the same time provided the same resources for expansion, exactly because there was a demographic and agricultural increase again, right? This is witnessed all over Europe, right? The problem is how you channel those resources, how you employ them, and how you distribute them at the end of the day. And this was still, however, very complicated to do, given what a 10th century state functioned like normally. And so it was just a way to secure his own power, right? You maintain your own, the legitimate emperor on the throne, and as we will see, in fact, after having imposed himself on the various claimants, Romanus was elevated in 920 to the rank of co-emperor by the same Constantine the Seventh, to whom Romanus had his daughter Helena married. And thus Romanus ended up to relegating the legitimate sovereign to the third place of the hierarchy, because he posed him after himself, but also after his own son Christopher, right? So he hoped there that by maintaining the same Constantine the Seventh, who had after all accepted to recognize him, probably without too many chances at that point, many other options, as co-emperor, he hoped to kind of be legitimized, Romanus thought to be legitimized enough to have also his own son kind of, well presented for maybe even imperial succession, that given that he was co-emperor himself. And Romanus was known Lekapenos, by the way, because he came from Lekape in Armenia, where he was originally of. He had been born in 870. He came from a peasant family that had made a career in the army, right? And that also makes you understand why he would be so defensive, in fact, of the peasantry, even though failing within his own reforms, right? Trained to safeguarding this class, and he embodied that kind of best meritocratic tradition of the Byzantine army in that sense, because he had become thus, just as a peasant, first strategos of Samos, to eventually assume as Drungarios the command of the imperial navy altogether. So these were very capable military men, and in on March the 25th, 919, he had landed in Constantinople. He had done it in time to avoid Zoe marrying the strategos Leo Phocas, by the way, because that was a way for, that empresses that didn't really exist as such, right? It was always only an emperor, right? And having they needed a male tutor, right? Men were the only ones capable of ruling. So Leophocus would have not been quite emperor at that point, but still a male figure would have also, as a general, would have reinforced Zoe's position. So in order to avoid this, Romanus had seized control of the imperial palace after having committed himself, by the way, to defend the rights of the legitimate sovereign in exchange, right? A bit hypocritically, propagandistically, but still, right? And eventually he did the same, but it was in fact either him or someone else. So, and after the marriage between his daughter Constantine the Seventh, was also elevated to the rank of Basileopator. That means the emperor's father. Right? So something more than just co-emperor. That was already a big deal. As you know, he became Caesar and thus associated emperor. Right? It actually happened later, but that was something more. It was something more dynastic in nature, as we've seen, more personal, more private even. That could be boasted at that point, also in front of the mob of Constantinople. Now, the reign of Romanus I was definitely a favorable time for the Byzantines after the instability followed to the death of Alexander, especially. And the peace concluded with the Bulgarians represented, in a sense, the most important aspect of it, because that was the storm that had caused most problems factually at that point. But this was also accompanied by other really remarkable events, among which the resolution of 920 of the vexata question of the 4 marriages of Leo VI that posed problems for also Constantine the Seventh, etc. And this was done in favor actually of Nicholas Mysticus, with the prohibition of the 4th marriage and the licity of the 3rd only in determinate conditions, right? And this was a way to undermine Zoe's figure fundamentally, and thus reinforcing Romanus as the one that had finally stepped in this difficult situation of minority of Constantine the Seventh, etc. And in June 920, there was a synod held in Constantinople, to which also papal legates took part, and this was concluded with the promulgation of the so-called Union Tome, let's say, that represented substantially a compromise in order to settle the question of tetragamy. And the condemnation of the 4th marriage was compensated with the absolution a posteriori of Leo VI on the aforementioned on the basis of the aforementioned principle of the economy. That is to say, the church could go beyond law in order to save the souls, right? And in this way, further, also the legitimacy of the Emperor Constantine the Seventh had been safeguarded, because at the end of the day, he was born out of legitimate marriage. And at the same time, it also justified, however, the party of Patriarch Euthymius that had legalized the same 4th marriage of Leo VI, because those had been done, as we've seen, according to the principle of economy. So it kind of was it gave a sense of closure politically, and it was eventually a success for the Patriarch Nicholas Mysticus, that after the papal acceptation of this union, the Tome Union in 923 officially declared a reconciliation with the Roman See, also regarding this fact, because, as we've seen, Leo had turned to the Pope to receive that dispensation, and this also, say, bringing to a further distance in a broader process effective competition between Rome and Constantinople. Romanos' epoch was marked by also the containment of the Erusian expansionism, and by important victories scored over the Arabs, against the Arabs. The Erusians had appeared for the first time in the Byzantine horizons in 860, where they had made famously an incursions in Pontus, eventually reaching up to Constantinople with their fleet. Their nation, as you know, I made videos about the Kievan Rus. It had constituted itself essentially during the 9th century with a similar process, frankly, to the one that had originated the Bulgarian state, essentially through the integration of this among the Eastern Slavic population settled in the Dnieper plains, and the one constituted by the mostly, at least, Swedish Vikings of Varangians that had taken over the country, at least as mercenaries. They had eventually married into the Slavic nobility, and Theodor have, demonstrated, satisfactorily, I would say, how still the Kievan Rus was fundamentally a Slavic thing, not really much of a, Viking state. And the Russian, the Russi, as they were called, the Rus by the Byzantines, came from, there are various explanations for the origins of this name, and some say it's the rowers, some other think that it has to do with water, with some aspect, however, that can be found in also previous etymologies of peoples inhabiting the Ukrainian plains, and that had settled in this continental region. In fact, the capital, which from the second half of the 9th century was placed in Kiev, that was emerging as the leading principality and the most florid center, the best connected with the Black Sea and St. Constantinople. And in 941, the Erusians appeared again in proximity of Constantinople, arriving to sack the Asian part of the Bosphorus. They didn't really have particularly sophisticated means at this point to, or power in that moment specifically to besiege Constantinople, etc. And they mostly looted at that point. And the imperial reaction was, however, effective because the invaders suffered a burning naval defeat when they were preparing for retreat. At this point, considered the Erusians were not Christianized, at least officially, and this would happen gradually over time. And in 943, the Prince Igor moved against the Byzantine Empire with the intention of attacking it from the Balkan Peninsula, but the Byzantine government was able to prevent this by concluding, a treaty. The victory against the Arabs were even more spectacular. In 924, in Lemnos, a naval squad of Leo of Tripolis was destroyed, right, reestablishing thus the control on the Eastern Mediterranean by the empire. These were pirates that had fundamentally exploited the instability of the situation, also the Saracen bases that had been established by the Islamic invasions in the Eastern Mediterranean, right, to maintain an important naval upper hand by a certain degree. But this victory importantly reconnected many Byzantine maritime centers and essentially displayed all the potential of the Byzantine fleet. Also made a video about the Byzantine naval warfare at this time of Leo VI. It also documents it in a way. Um, it's actually, I think, also, yeah, I made one about the Byzantine sailor of the 10th century, so if you're interested, I also made that thing. However, the naval theater, the maritime theater operation was, as you know, secondary. At the time, ships fundamentally were just functional for armies proceeding along the coast, so the importance of crushing an enemy fleet mostly consisted still having an important, let's say, strategic projection on land, which took another direction, however, even from the same Aegean, because in the following years, other operations were waged mostly in Armenia and in Mesopotamia. These were very important because they would secure the eastern flank of the empire. These were heavily mountainous, say, from Armenia. You could secure those passes that entered, especially the Tigris Valley, and from there Byzantines could launch offensives, etc. Very, very far, very stretched areas. Constantinople would never have like a secure control on them ever, but still, it was quite important to harass the Abbasids, right, and showing that the empire still had it, and also distracting from the caliphal power from other operations, mostly in Syria. In fact, in 934, Melita was reconquered. The operations were carried out eventually against the emir of Mosul and of Aleppo, Saif ad-Dawla of the Hamdanid dynasty. There is some debate about this politically strategic debate regarding the Hamdanid position had not been too threatening, could serve also kind of buffer state, but still, it's better to secure those territories that are on the outer side, to consolidate, to stabilize, pacify the ones within. Anatolia was quite important because mostly of the bulk of the military forces of the empire also feared attack method were mostly recruited from there, heavy cavalry. And as we've seen, the same Romanos came from Armenia, so he knew better how important that area was. The clash, by the way, had some alternating phases, but it concluded itself with the substantial supremacy of the Byzantines that recovered important border strongholds. In 944, the Byzantines also recovered the Mandulion of Edessa, today's Urfa in southern Turkey, one of the most important Christian relics that was brought solemnly to Constantinople. And the legend went that during the Persian siege of Edessa of 554, among, let's say, within the city walls, a cloth, in medieval Greek, a mandilion, in fact, was found, and over it an image that was deemed of Christ, the miraculous figure. The Mandulion is like part of a broader set kind of legends started since the 4th century concerning essentially would be the sin done by different. There were many of these relics at the same time were used in different circumstances, and the image of Edessa represents the most important among Christ's figures that initiated their appearance around more or less the 6th century, and were deemed as akeiropoieted, that is to say, primitive alpha, kairos is hand, and poieted would be painted. So literally images that were not drawn by a hand that is a human hand, right? So made by God, even just per se. And there are many of these scattered all over Christendom, really. And according to the most credited legion, because we're talking, generally speaking, about very archaic, primitive time, you know that the Byzantines also were not particularly digressive. They mostly fixed that idea and that it was it, right? So there are no much details. There's not a massive, even just kind of a florid, decentralized polity or middle class that can simply comment, criticize, whatever. Just what we get from the official sources very often, or some similar ones by style and content. At the end of the day, is what we get. And this legend says that the image of the Mandylion had formed at the moment in which Jesus had fundamentally posed his face on this cloth, and eventually this had been brought to Abgar, king of Edessa, the envoy of which had gone to Christ on behalf of the king. And the image remained in Edessa during the Arab domination, and it thus escaped, consequently, the iconoclastic persecution. Interestingly enough, because I made a video recently about the iconoclasm, as we've seen how complex and different things were, but the reason why, again, it was preserved, likely because this had been in Byzantine control in iconoclastic time, would have probably been destroyed, right? We don't have time now to digress, but again, I made multiple videos about iconoclasm you can easily find. And during the siege of 944, the generals of Romanos I promised to spare the city under the condition that this icon would have been given to them. And that's when it was sent to Constantinople, where it was placed in a chapel of the imperial palace. But it disappeared in 1204 when the Crusaders took over Constantinople, and probably was brought in the West at that point. And so some say that, at least to a somewhat credited theory, that the Mandylion of Edessa could be identified with a Sindon that appears in the West a century after the take of Constantinople by the Crusaders. But anyhow, it's much more complicated than this. I'm not going to I need an entire video just to explain the entire story of what we think these relics actually are and when they were made at the point, because the same church said that, at the beginning, and then people they were made up, right? And they were just used as a form of veneration, but the faithful, as always, thought otherwise, never listening to authority. But coming back to our Macedonian 10th century, Romanos I sought, as we were saying before, to put an end to the development of the latifundium through a legislation in favor of the small landowners, like the ones whose milieu he came from. And such legislation is particularly important because for the first time it documents a phenomenon that eventually would have taken on a remarkable width up to becoming an element of the solution of the traditional imperial administrative system. That is to say, the strengthening of the great land ownership at the expense of the small one, due to the acquisitions of new lands from the side of the large estates owners. The process actually by this point was already marked, right? The Byzantine Empire had been founded with the intention of strictly controlling the populace, this phenomenon, but let's say over time, even though it had succeeded not to privatize and decentralize, like for example the Western powers were, so that those would evolve as states literally from the feudal system already, and sometimes having a great gluing factor. I mean, by the 12th century, the Byzantines began to feel that pressure, right? But in comparison, let's say in the Byzantine world, that large land ownership had been limited over time. And so it's, however, not true that it did not exist, or that what we're witnessing already by the 10th century was like, it was just like the good old days where, the Roman soldier was just a peasant, then when called up to arms, he brought his own arms, his own weapons to war, and fought and came back plowing the fields, and the system worked successfully. It had never existed, right? And the Byzantine world had always remained, had already been founded a moment to which there were major landowners and oligarchs that were unavoidably going through the various crises of the empire, especially the big one of the Islamic invasions, but also at other points autonomized, right? Also considering how large the empire really was, and which kind of means normally it had to control the hinterland, right? And so it's normal. This thing had been preserved in part. The older system had been preserved because the empire had remained somewhat urban and coastal. So, in a way, competing for power was still doing it within the statal structures. But as we will see, there was a lot of corruption, as always, in the world at the time, everywhere, from the smallest tribes to larger states. And actually, larger states functioned somewhat better, exactly, given the enormous difficulties of keeping them together in proportion. So the system was naturally being eroded from the within anyway, because yes, the state existed. There was nothing outside the state in the Byzantine world. Nothing. Everybody was framed under, say, within that system, that hierarchy of some sort. But of course, the internal privatization of the system was normal, was just a broader process that was occurring everywhere. It was occurring in the West, in the Byzantine Empire, in the Islamic world, right? It couldn't really be stopped. It was I'd say, given the difficulties that civilizational structures had during early medieval times, there was no other way, right? People would have had to take over, especially in a decentralized position. And the large estates owners had kind of always existed. Remember the Bucellari retinues in the 6th century, these private forces levied by the magnates. That already tells you the moment in which the empire was even more stabilized than this one, how strong private power really was. In any case, the system had been virtuous again because everything headed to Constantinople in a way or another. So even the career, the opportunities to expand territorially, did not exist outside that space. There were other powers, and it didn't make sense given what the Byzantines had to just trade that for an autonomization outside of the state. But still within the state, this thing happened. And again, with Romanos I, we have it documented for the first time because of this legislation. We can understand it, as most think Byzantine before, especially in the previous centuries, were not really clear at all in early medieval times, because there is no evidence, right? At least the evidence is very, scattered and inconsistent, and just can't guess certain things, but we don't see them specifically addressed. So, and the fact that Romanos was trying to counter this does show that the erosion of the small land ownership was already advanced by this point. So, in general, trying to counter it was probably just a containing measure, right? Not even the Macedonian emperors thought that the system could be actually reversed, or even if they thought that, probably was intended very ideally, and they knew much better than us that this was kind of not concretely possible, but they hope to expand further, especially from bases that could be considered still, again, centralizing mostly again in Constantinople, and consolidating on it a more public structure, but drawing resources from the provinces rather than entrusting power to the provinces anyway. This had always been kind of the dynamic. The themes had been established because the empire was forced to decentralize by the crisis of the 7th century. Not even though they existed already before by a certain degree, and administrative structures were really similar over time and everywhere, so we don't have to be too structuralist about these things. But the point being rather the possibility of stemming the speed of the disgregation, kind of slowing it down and trying to shift resources, keeping under control the right people in some way. So this process that had followed the strengthening of the landed aristocracy had already accelerated dramatically after the crisis of the 7th century. It represented a great danger for the state because the economical, financial, and military power of it was based on this free peasants and on the colonist soldiers. Were still communities scattered. They had also some kind of military nature, considering, again, how frontier the frontier really was. Pick the eastern one, or the Balkans. Especially in the interland, like there were cities, etc., but the word very often of the countries was different, right? So having these troops as some kind of armed communities that could also defend the area by getting something else in exchange, including, as we will see, some privileges, some rights as communities rather than individual people, was a way to have literally a military presence in areas that otherwise would have not had any reason to be even under imperial control, for that matter. So that's why they were so crucial, really. They didn't even care about the single people in these communities being actually free or whatever. They just wanted to have these communities maintaining their own autonomy, so that no other major landowner that still existed, fragmented within this, interspersed within these worlds, also very interconnected, also not just with the frontier, but they had possessions scattered all over the empire, could take them over and therefore use those resources to create some kind of little states within the state. So that was the actual problem. And since let's say, the central power would have been significantly crippled, as you understand, by this collapse. And so, since the institution of the themes, the small property formed this supporting structure of imperial public authority. The villagers' communities were constituted by free farmers. They were like fiscal entities responsible toward the state and not subject to the patronage of the landowners as communities. The loss of land, on the contrary, that happened, as we'll see now for different reasons, implied the subtraction of income and of people to the state, right? Because when somebody like a peasant passed to the service of the large landowners that in exchange protected them from imperial functionaries, how could you reach them? Right? Imperial functionaries were not tender people, and the peasantry was still meant to provide with military service. Some areas were threatened. There was brigandage, if anything. The same large landowners were kind of a mob that still tended to gradually deresponsabilize the local people and just paying a tribute to them like hush money and then taking care of the same defense of the system. But again, this was in the it was stripped from the public income, and so in order to restore the imperial authority there, you should have waged fundamentally a war within your own territory. It was kind of a, it would have significantly weakened the same local social and economical fabric in the first place further. So it would have not really solved the problem, given the chronic instability of power politically. This situation had come to exist just because the peasantry preferred to give up their own liberty in exchange for protection, which is the same thing you see in the West, right? Just it happened in the Byzantine Empire in a more gradual way because the state was more present in general. And so the state was also losing manpower, the soldiers, that given that those performances that under the form of corvée fundamentally were required to the peasants and the tributes that ended up in the hands of the landed aristocracy were also attracted to the actual material properly, the material actually that was used for the same equipment, or at least an equivalent of it. And the same people, if they didn't have what to train and what to maintain their autonomy in arms, they would simply abandon that. There was a very specific, heavy, and systemic way to maintain a military community fit, right? And these are just throwaway militias because they just can't afford a greater collective training, better equipment. These become ipso facto ineffective. So with the law of 922, Romanos I reestablished the right of, let's say, we can say pre-purchasing of the plots, of the land plots from the side of the neighbors in case of alienation, right? The norm was known in Greek as protimesis, and it had been abolished by Leo VI. That with this and other provisions had instead reinforced the aristocracy. Interestingly enough, to see that even the imperial policy had at some point thought more convenient by a certain degree to reinforce actually the private rules so that they would be able to co-opt actually larger landowners rather than this more fragile system that was already giving signs of collapse. So the protimesis consisted in the preemption right of the neighbor in case of selling of a property to make it remain within the villager communities, right? So thus avoiding the passage to the great landowners. Very often this system was legal, right? People didn't, just funds didn't have owners anymore, that they couldn't work on them. So somebody would just make them an offer. These people were not just very affluent, so they would accept it, and the landowners would gradually take over these. The large estate owners would take over these areas, and they also had probably a better idea of how to put them to work collectively, because the latifundium per se was not just even so large to be just left on its own, right? It was still exploited, but it depended. Anyhow, Romanos I gave a precise definition of the protimesis with the end of limiting to the most the chance that the land could pass from the poor to the powerful. This is the terminology that was used in the law. And in fact, if the land was sold or rented, there were some favored individuals that could enjoy this preemptive right of purchase. 5 categories that in interest of fact of privilege went like this, that were the relatives that co-owned fundamentally the land, other co-owners, then the owners of uh, of land plots that were comprehended within the land that was to be alienated. So this was aimed at maintaining a territorial coherence also of the communities, a compactness, so that somebody would live literally next door to those that had to defend this land, and also to provide with military service, to facilitate at most, just to preserve all the resources in local, right? Then there were the owners of land plots that were bordering the one to alienate, and that paid taxes in common. And finally, other land owners of the neighboring plots. So you understand, it's again from the within. The core of the villagers' communities had to be maintained by keeping their land together, right, and making, even in case of alienation, still not some random people to take them, even legally, but still before those who lived closer that perhaps had in fact also an interest in the same way, meaning that this system, as you understand, is also favoring kind of the emergence of more powerful people within the same communities, right? But it was better than nothing, right? So of course the legislation was not attempted to make miracles, but still, again, slowing down a process that seemed by a certain degree at least uncontrollable. And only if because you could say, well, no, there is a certain amount of land, I come as the state and I will safeguard it and I will decide what this goes to. No, it says basically just we can't control that. No state could do that at the time. And so it was just at least defining who was lawful to take that terrain or not, or at least setting even some this kind of hierarchy of those who had that right to take the terrain, but not necessarily to be wanting that at some point, because that was also the problem, right? Maybe these people didn't have the means even to put it to culture or something, and or they were, however, also intimidated by the larger landowners to just give it away, or as we will see, that were just maybe tired of paying taxes to the state rather to the other land, or maybe it depends really on the situation. We're not, I think, dramatically documented on this, but we're not talking about insignificant amount of land, however, right? This is also important. At least the Byzantine legislation is relatively capillary about this, but we think that naturally the problems that had been perceived by the administration were for some larger amounts of land usually. And only if though the aforementioned 5 categories were exhausted, the land could be legally given to other people, right? And the powerful, furthermore, could not accept gifts or inheritances from the poor, unless they were not married into them. So a very strict divide. The acquired land, in transgression to the norm, had to be given back without indemnity. And for the goods of the soldiers, there was a duty of restitution that was extended retroactively to the last 30 years, right? So even attempting to say, well, we can't take it back, even if it's 30 years at a time, was half a person's life, right? So was something that had started a long time before, and the fact that imperial legislation says, well, even just before 30 years we can't ask, right, really speaks of the entitlement really that those who had gotten that land had, even though they had taken them with violence or unlawfully in the first place. And predictably, Romanos Lekapenos law revealed itself ineffective. Also because major events. You can't really control it just with intentions. For example, the famine of 927-28 that had that caused a massive alienation of small property to the powerful. Right? People are starving. They don't give a damn about what's legal, what they have to do. They just get under those who can provide for them. Romanos I emanated as a consequence a second law, probably 934, with which prescribed the invalidity of gifts, inheritance, and contracts, similarly to the ones of the first law, and the restitution without indemnity of goods paid less than half of the value. Of course, the latifundia holders were blackmailing peasantry at that point where they were starving. Also, the restitution of goods paid regularly against a reimbursement within 3 years of the price of the purchase, and the prohibition for the future of new illegal purchases against the penalty of giving back without indemnity the same property. So this measure too was destined to remain inapplicable due to factors that simply escaped the control of central government. Right? The harsher you get means that the less you can actually, the more it's failing. Right? If it's over, especially part of a policy that you have already trying to enforce and was already kind of harsh since the beginning. Right? You cannot avoid this system to decay if you don't have the means to actually enforce something different yourself, right? In the first place, in fact, it was difficult for the peasants ruined by the famine could simply give back the purchasing price, and at the same time, the functionaries that had to give back the illegally obtained land were in general the same purchasers, or maybe their relatives or their friends. By rule, in fact, the powerful was at the same time a large state owner and stattal functionary, and this of superimposition of interests also later on would have obstacled the protectionistic norms. And this is, after all, the main reason for which the agrarian policy of the Macedons failed, right? At the end of the day, it was sabotaged by those who should have had the law respected. So issuing that law in the first place was kind of, just an attempt to reverse the situation, but it was just happening way beyond the same Byzantine world, right? This was not an isolated system, and similar dynamics were happening pretty much everywhere. Consider the same Macedonians were waging wars, and soldiers that have to stay far from home for a long time, at some point will kind of have to be detached from that kind of peasant soldier kind of ideal, because they have to be simply maintained, right? The state must give them a salary to remain in arms, and relying on them, on this archaic system, which a villager's community has to provide with an actual good soldier and motivated one. It's something that didn't work practically anywhere anymore, right? Here we are in the 10th century. This is exactly the time in which the same happens in Europe. The military class rises, and as we will see at some other point, the 10th century Byzantine army was reformed along the same kind of professional pattern, even with the establishment of some sort of Constantinopolitan force. It was saying, we don't even want to rely on the provincial armies anymore, because the system was creeping in, as we've seen. The same latifundia owners were the same functionaries. How could you expect anything could change in that sense? You had to give reasons to these provinces not to rebel, to actually co-opt their leaders, and probably even accelerating that process of privatization if you wanted more grip on that. Surely it would have brought to some kind of severe contrast, as we've seen there were all these various rebellions. The same Romanos had taken over himself. It was probably felt by him as a great success to be one of those peasants who had become de facto emperor, right? Because of merit. There was probably something behind that in those terms. But in this regard, I think it was myopic to think otherwise. I mean, Basil I had not thought this policy to be valid, and instead Romanos tended to reverse it, and instead, guess what happened on the long run, right? It simply didn't work, right? Never underestimate, in this sense, the moral forces again, but don't do it pretending that the law is just there to be obeyed. Again, the laws exist because people are to be given a motive to have them respected, and it's a very difficult task civilizationally. And in fact, I don't think we are realizing fully what is happening right now, because people don't understand the point anymore of things. Not because they have a good reason, but simply because they're growing more stupid. And that's simply it, right? There was a time in which people could earn more. Now there is stagnation, so those same mechanisms that supported a specific mindset and beliefs, even if very superficially understood, were at least driving the thing. Now it contracts the thing, and the person has nothing because has never had anything really in their head, and so they start rolling backwards, right? And that's dumb, but it's dumb because people don't have those resources, right? If somebody is really poorer and poorer and is told, it just is too frustrating. You also don't have effectively moral resources, and you can try to counter that, but it's very hard. So the result is not really giving money to people per se, but at least establishing those conditions where they can earn them by themselves. And it's always a double threat problem and a very complicated one to solve. So, perhaps even in the wake of these difficulties, Romanos I was deposed by a coup promoted by his own sons that feared at that point to be excluded by the succession, given that we've seen it was rather just Christopher to be favored. But short time afterwards, they were taken out in turn by Constantine the Seventh, after actually a popular uprising in favor of the legitimate sovereign that thus arrived to be the sole emperor after having been for more than 20 years at the margin of royal power. This is quite interesting after all, and it speaks of that popular sympathy towards the legitimate dynasty. So that evidently Romanos, yes, great soldier, had this kind of, if you want, even more traditional ideas but had not managed to convince in a broader sense, and probably in a refined, sophisticated, and effective way, kind of what had needed to be done, right? So the community was rowing towards another direction and decided that the greater stability derived from the legitimate rule of Constantine. Now, Constantine the Seventh historiographically passes down with the name of Porphyrogenitos, which means to be born in the purple, which is actually what most emperors had as a name, because they were born in this area of the imperial palace known as the Porphyra that was all in purple, and so they literally born in the purple, in that room where the walls were in the marbles were that color, and that was naturally a symbol of divinity, of the empire, of nobility, of life, of strength, of power. But I don't know, when we call still the Byzantine emperors normally with their name, we don't add the actual titling that they really had. Constantine was kind of the only one, exactly perhaps because historiography wanted to reinforce the fact that the people had wanted him because he was Porphyrogenitus. It was not the son of Romanos and of other no ones in terms of status, at least by birth, and that's also quite strong genetic idea. But I don't know, if I say Basil II, everybody knows him as Bulgaroctonos because of the nickname that he probably never liked or wanted. Like, the people called him like that, or at least actually historians called him like that, because at the time there was not probably it was an insult to nickname an emperor. He was Porphyrogenitus as well, right, notoriously, but still, that's the point. And you say, Schwerpunkt, you make videos by saying that using the term Byzantine is fine. Yeah, because that's a bigger deal, and it has to do with the same cause of the end of the empire and why such things happen, rather than, denying the Romanity of the empire, which is impossible, nor, in fact, these other titles that are quite meaningful and have to do, for better or for worse, with the specific features of Byzantine civilization. So that his name, his surname, if you want, historiographically, is indirect, say, hint of the gradual affirmation of a sense of dynastic legitimacy in Constantinople, which up to some time before it had, say, it had been there, but it was considered more flexible compared to other places, where at least still it was to be defined in the world of that time, which was not entirely clear. Still, also in the West, there was still a way of considering the fitness connected to other elements that were still always considered genetic, because they had always been, but that had to be recognized as such, right? You could be even born from the legitimate ruler, but being a pretty bad ruler yourself, so you had to demonstrate it in the first place, and that's how people thought at some point, right? That the genes had to do with that, and that, however, genes were different, and so the people had different qualities and characteristics, both morally and physically at the same time. So the Constantine the Seventh ruled between 913 and 959. Start from this. He didn't bring any substantial changes in the governmental practice of Romanos, telling the truth. His agrarian policy remained, in fact, on the one maintained by Lekapenos, probably because, again, he hoped to stem that same private push that at some point could be beneficial, and he couldn't simply just reverse the thing and say, okay, well, you can seize all the land you want. Could have never been the case. That was the public position, and after all, even though his father had gone the other direction, he preferred to maintain that, for reasons also that we don't know, frankly, about all these various decisions in 10th century emperors. What the hell, we have a very meager understanding of who these people were personally. In terms of foreign policy, the war with the Arabs was the main thing. After the failure of an expedition in 941 against the Islamic pirates of Crete that had nested there and were terrorizing the Aegean, and very often these people were sometimes even Christian and Greek, right? That's the true story of the Saracens. We're mostly talking very often about not really just North Africans, Near Easterns, were very often Europeans themselves, right? Even Christian, right? The religion had relatively to do. There were Muslims also in the imperial army, and so on. But there was some further war on the Eastern Front, up to some clamorous success of two of the greatest commanders in Byzantine history. They would have both become emperors. In turn, we'll see it another time, that are Nicephorus Phocas and John Zimisces. they conquered respectively the city of Adat in Pamphylia and Samosata on the Euphrates. This was an important consolidation on the southeastern border. Famously enough, Nicephorus Phocas would be known as the Pale Death of the Saracens because of his splendid victories against the Muslims. Thus, the favorable tendency to the arms of the empire was consolidating, and it protracted eventually in the following years. So it was an expansionistic and also consolidational phase, proving that the empire had successfully withstood the early medieval centuries to the point of essentially remounting from the bases that had just remained from the much larger dominion before. And so this was also morally a massive coming back of imperial capacity a bit everywhere in Europe, in the Mediterranean. Characteristic of Constantine the Seventh is also the intense diplomatic activity with foreign courts. The most famous one, we made a video about Olga of Kiev, when the princess came to Constantinople in 957, she converted to Christianity, sojourning for some time also at the court of Constantinople. And that paved the way eventually for some good relations with the Kievan Rus and the same the Christianization of the same, where, as you know, Constantinople had a leading role in and securing some important connections in the Black Sea, etc. In 949, Liutprand of Cremona was in Constantinople. He was an ambassador of Berengar II, Marquis of Ivrea. We were talking about him the other day, that video about medieval Burgundy, and future king of Italy, and he was essentially later on also an Ottonian ambassador. So we have a story about the embassy that went on for some months in the famous Antipodesis, a historical work written by the same Liutprand that says a lot of interesting things, especially regarding the Germanicity and the Romanity of the empire. And part of it is fictional, because Liutprand states to have said to the emperor certain specific things that would have had him killed, and this one, however, refers to the one sent to Nicephorus Phocas when he became emperor eventually, rather than the one at the time of Constantine. And we're talking about 17 years later, but it's meaningful that the individual eventually was chosen by Otto I later on to say in a moment of great revival, as you know, of the Western Empire, where the Ottonians were coming to grips with the Byzantines. Also in southern Italy, there was a lot of attrition. But let's say this Western presence in Constantinople is very, very meaningful, because Liutprand at that point was also a spy, as of course, and an observer and a provoker, right? He thought of himself like a Longbard to be superior to these Romans meant as the decayed ones, in a contemporary sense. And that, of course, yes, the Romanity of the empire was universal, but that it had been taken, he says, by we, the Longbards, the Saxons, the Bavarians, etc. When we want to insult someone, we say, "Hey, you Roman," right? So, and this guy was essentially an Italian speaking Romance. So just thinking about that. So we will talk about that again, because in the last weeks I would say some, at least you appreciated those videos. about the topic, but the embassy of Liutprand to Nicephorus is really a thing. And again, he could have never said the things he said because he would have been killed. But it's meaningful that he wrote them back to Italy, also for, generally speaking, at that point, the Ottonian, fruition, we can't say, but with a very mind-opening reality about what the West was now compared to Constantinople. There is actually a very big space that is worth remembering to Constantine the Seventh literary activity. He probably had a time until he was 27, say before governing, but also after that, to dedicate himself to other activities rather than government. In fact, he was a man of culture before the man of state. He protected the arts. He was himself a collectionist and a valiant painter, interestingly enough. By his impulse, particular flourishing the encyclopedic literature typical of the time was boosted. For example, with the compilation of numerous works that were commissioned to scholars or drafted sometimes personally by the sovereign. And in fact, we can remember some works of the same Constantine the Seventh. Most famous one is definitely the De Ceremoniis Aule Byzantinae, better known as the Book of Ceremonies, the Liber de Ceremoniis, or simply De Ceremoniis. So this is a difficult work to understand for a 21st century mind, but let's say it's a treatise on the Byzantine ceremonial, of which Constantine the Seventh wanted to fix a model. So this is in the Byzantine mindset, again, the perpetua sanctio, the inalterable order of the universe that the imperial court had to represent, with its offices, with its times, rhythms that were scanned. The Byzantine court was all kind of frozen. You couldn't do, like, you had to say extremely specific words. You had to move only in a certain specific way. There was a sort of show being mounted up, and everybody had to conform strictly to that, right? Nothing compared to, the Versailles of Louis XIV is a circus in comparison, right? And that was quite strict. The Byzantine one, you would have not probably even wanted to know how it really was, but it had to represent that absolute perfection and splendor and greatness and absoluteness of the empire itself. But this work, which is pretty messed up, as we will see now, probably from a literary point of view, I mean, it's well written, but it was put together in a very strange way, also for us to study, has a remarkable importance to reconstruct the courtly life of the time. The Ceremonies was written between 938 959, so over time. This didn't help the drafting, this is the point. And it includes description of religious, civil, and even profane ceremonies. And to these are added also texts of different arguments, among which there are, for example, also historical relations. So at least how it arrived to us, it's more like a compilation of different texts, and it's a rather chaotic one. It provides with numerous problems of critical textual nature. That's why I'm a historian, I'm not a philologist, and I want my life to be easier. But it's, however, a mine of historical information on topics that otherwise would have not been discussed. I mean, especially at that time, it's really a unique work, and we are very glad of having it. And on the base of the Liber de Ceremoniis, for example, the modern historians have attempted to reconstruct the topography of the Byzantine imperial palace, about which basically we don't have anything, because when the Ottomans built the top capital, it went lost, right? So we don't have sources throughout the whole Byzantine millennium to essentially know how this palace really was, right? We have some idea, of course, archaeologically, and that there is some historical information, but we don't know, to the point that even the same Liber has been interpreted in different ways, right, with different outcomes, right? But surely much better ones than the ones that we can have archaeologically. Let's be honest, archaeology is overrated. And there are, in fact, many references that grant to establish the essential lines in the disposition, the function, and sometimes properly the internal structure of the various buildings of this enormous complex that the palace was, extending between the central forum of the city, that is the Augusteon, and the Marmara Sea. Other works of Constantine the Seventh are the Vita Basili, that is the life of Basil, so a celebrative biography of Constantine's grandfather Basil I, aimed at exalting the figure and the character at the same time to, silence the least clear aspect, let's say, of his rise to the throne. And there is the Thematicus, the book on the themes, which is historical geographical treatise on the provinces of the empire, and then the De Administrando Imperio, that is to say, on the administration of the empire, on how to administrate the empire, that Constantine the Seventh dedicated to his son Romanos, and it's a sort of speculum principis, right? A sort of manual of good government with wide informations on the peoples that came to contact with the world of Constantinople. There are the references to what the barbarians wanted from Constantinople, the princesses burning purple, the liquid fire. There is naturally an ethnographic interest that is part of the Byzantine tradition that had, however, somewhat sclerotized. You already know, we have seen it, because when making those videos about some peoples and their military customs described by the Byzantines, normally the Strategicon in the 6th century was an original and excellent work. Then Leo VI basically writes the Tactica, that is the same work except some minimal addition regarding the same peoples, because in part, they were kind of the same after 3 centuries, in at least in the type of warfare in many ways. So you understand already, this is a moment of the revival of Byzantine culture, but at the same time of kind of insistence on itself, on its same models, on its same ideas, and this is characteristic and identificative of the same Byzantine culture. But this flourishing is mirrored by also other and less known works that have to do with the properly still the courtly ceremonial that became central, as central was the imperial monarchy. This works mostly deal with was becoming important in the palace, that is the system of figures, of functionaries, of precedences at court. The most important one is the Kletorologion of Philotheos, composed in 899 and eventually inserted in the aforementioned Book of the Ceremonies of Constantine the Seventh. The author of the Kletorologion was an Atriclines himself. Atriclines derives as many words of the Byzantine bureaucracy from Latin, in this case from a triclinio. So literally the guy that was to deal with the triclinium, so where the ancient Romans banqueted. So he essentially organized the official ceremonies at the table, at the banquets, that were in fact some of the most important moments of the Saint Palatine ceremonial. And that there are interesting parallelisms you can draw with the aforementioned Liutprand's anthropolysis that as the Western ambassadors described the same imperial court, which was splendid and beautiful, and it would have been fantastic just to be there and see how it really was. And the banquets normally happened in specific days, right? Some varied but they were still part of a regularity, right? This overlapped with the principal festivals. Fundamentally, they were regulated by a very picky etiquette based essentially on the orders of the precedences, in fact, with which you had to take place next to the sovereign, right? This is quite, it was just a huge honor. The Kletorologion, besides this specific topic, in its most theoric part, also provides with precise indications on the hierarchy of the time, so that we can reconstruct it in detail, importantly enough. So the bureaucratic apparatus had naturally changed a lot since the late antiquity, and it had followed kind of a natural process of, from one side, devaluation of or updating of the older titles that, however, had remained aware and not. That is, these were offices proposed to a certain amount of resources that were initially connected to a specific task, but then the office wouldn't be taken away because, again, the Byzantine mentality was very traditionalist. But at the same time, the officials would have different prerogatives as they were men of power, and let's say throughout all the various political, military, and social upheavals, they would be contingently provided with other powers, and so some functionaries that were deputed to one thing came to control another. There were superimpositions. They were very intricate and apparently incoherent, but everything had developed, in fact, in a logical sense, if you follow the history, that unfortunately we can't do exactly, and so that's why this work is so important for the Macedonian era. But that, adapted, like, kind of, this logic was part of the entire Byzantine history, practically. So the courtesans were divided into distinct categories. The simple court dignitaries devoid of administrative tasks, the levels of nobility, which, and for example, the lifelong revenues that were theoretically irrevocable, by the way, implied as sole task the honorific participation to the Palatine ceremonies, and that there were those entrusted instead with a specific duty function, both military and civil, for a determined time. The first ones received the so-called dignities for the insignia. That is to say, they were distinguished, say, by a sort of specific badge or an ensign, in fact, of the office, while the second obtained a vocal or legal dignity, so-called by voice or by edict. So they could be conferred by a simple verbal appointment by the emperor. That was the world ruler, so you couldn't really, comment too much on the decision. That invested of effective functions of command in the various branches of the state. And as in older times, furthermore, to one title function was accompanied kind of a fixed palatine dignity that posed the title holder in a nobiliar estate, fundamentally attributing to him the relative privileges First of all, the framing within a complicated hierarchy of precedences, in fact, that defined social status. And the peculiar characteristic of the time is instead the existence of two distinct hierarchies, both for the dignities by ensign and for the others, of which one was reserved to the so-called bearded and the other to the eunuchs, right? The importance of which at court was remarkable since the earlier times and had been increasing during the centuries, so up to making up effective the caste rates as a specific, very particular estate of dignitaries and functionaries. The titles for the bearded, so for the non-castrated, the non-eunuchs, let's put it in this way, were 18. And they derived from innovations, and in some part they came from late antiquity, and also for those that were like transformations of old or disappeared offices, or the ones of which the name just had survived. And the highest step, so in decreasing order the of importance, the dignities of Caesar, most noble, Curopalatus, conferred normally to the members of the imperial family. Then there were eventually the Zoste Patricia, that is the female patrician with belt. It was the only female dignity in all this. The one of magister, that magistros at least, or magisters in medieval Greek, that was a residual of the ancient magister officiorum. The Antipatus, the patrician, the protospatarius, the dissipatus, that is the twice-time consul, the Spatarocandidatus, the Spatarius, the Epatus, right? That still was a thing because the Epatus is the Greek equivalent of the ancient consul office, interestingly enough. There was the Strator, the Candidatus, the Mandator, the Vestitor, the Silentiarius, the Strelates, Epitematon, or Apoeparchon, and many other titles, and it's pretty messed up, right? The grades of nobility of the eunuchs were 8: Nipis Stiarius, Cubicularius, Spataro Cubicularius, Ostiarius, Primicarius, Protospatarius, Prepositus, and Patricius. The vocal dignities for the bearded were 60, right, corresponding to the most elevated posts of command, and from each one of these the heads of service depended more or less wide office with administrative functionaries. And at the top of the 60 public offices, there were the Basileo Pater, that we have seen also Romanos I having assumed as the father of the emperor because, he was his father-in-law, the Rector, and his Syncellus. The first office had been already instituted by Leo VI. Telling the truth, he was a sort of tutor of the sovereign, as we've seen, that in strictly administrative terms was provided with full powers. And the Rector was a rather imprecise function, while the Syncellus was because we don't understand very often what they actually were meant to for, right? And so the Syncellus, we do know, it was the ecclesiastic that the clergyman that worked as an assistant of the patriarch appointed by the sovereign. There were then the great military commands, starting from the strategos of the Anatolians, and the theme of the Anatolians that was the most important, as we were saying before, where most of the Byzantine army was based. Immediately followed in hierarchical order by the domesticus of the Scholae, both with the rank of Antipatus and Patricius, which tells you, by the way, how central really, again, Anatolia was. Like it was like the collegial office, and you would have the two main military figures being literally the palace guards and the commander of the Anatolian army. So that's quite relevant. Considered the Byzantine army at this point had something like between 70 to 90,000 men, depending on the situation. Mostly decentralized, but still with a relevant, field army capability at the core. Then there was a series of other military and civilian officers up to the 60th place that we will not list because it's terrifying, but you can always read it if you're interested. And the hierarchy of the eunuchs instead comprehended 9 vocal dignities, as much as Philotas lists, even though he actually lists 10, perhaps because of an interpolation in the text that has been manipulated. This one instead we read the parakoimomenos, that is of the emperor, that is to say literally he who had to deal with the sovereign rule. The protovestiarius of the emperor preposed to the table of the emperor. The preposed to the table of the emperors. Then the papias, it would be like the gatekeeper in a sense of the great palace, the deuteros, the substitute of the gatekeeper of the great palace, because you may not know what could happen there. And the pinkernes, that is the kurfürst, like the cup bearer of the emperor, and that of the emperors, of course, the papias of the palace of Magnaura and the one of the palace of Daphne. And differently from what happened for the bearded, the vocal dignities of the eunuchs comparatively entailed effective services at court, because they were eunuchs, and so they could not really take over the internal power. At least ideally they would. I mean, not themselves, because their physical unfitness couldn't make them succeed as emperors, but still they could support some claimant. The eunuchs could furthermore exercise almost all the public function of the bearded as well out of the palace, except the one of Eparchus, Quaestor, and Domesticus, that is to say, the governor of Constantinople, the head of the judiciary department, derived from the ancient Quaestor Sacri Palazzi, and the military commander, because these posts were just for somebody provided with an imperium, or at least with some higher dignity that the eunuchs did not own because of their status. So this reflects naturally the massive administration of the empire, and how much of it was controlled directly by the emperor, by these appointments from within the palace. And in fact, all these dignities were to participate to the court ceremonial exactly because they had to fit even mentally within the hierarchy in this very complicated order that they had to be tested on. Like if you screwed up by saying something wrong at the wrong time, or moving like you didn't have, you were not done for, but surely you would have felt like, oh my god, I'm not fit to the task. Because it was a psychological way to kind of say, remember always that you are under somebody else's empire de facto. And so it was a way to also to fuel competition, but from within the same state. So not really, let's say, as we've seen, of course, the military and civilian officers were also sent out in the world, as some of the eunuchs were, but still the palace of Constantinople, and thus Constantinople, were becoming the empire. Right? This is the main thing. The empire is Constantinople, and Constantinople is the empire. And this broader project, let's say, this broader reconquest and gradual also privatization would bring to, in fact, the Constantinopolitan Okiaka to be continuously, let's say, to be all massed within Constantinople, that fundamentally would import resources from all the rest. At some point, Crete, when reconquered from the Arabs, would become the, for example, the Komneno's backyard, right? All the resources were imported. Most of the imperial resources were drawn from there, properly from the imperial dynasty, right? It was just like a private possession of the Komnenoi they had their own Okiaka as emperors at that point. But there were all the other Okiaka in the city that were like big households and guilds, but they were all privately owned by the major oligarchic families that eventually mixed all into, they're a bit all the same in Byzantine history, especially in the later time, that you see them there always. And they, because they had unmasked enormous power, that as we've seen also with Romanos and Constantine the Seventh, was trying to be recovered and at least preserved from kind of distraction, say usurpation from the oligarchy. But the oligarchy became the establishment at the end of the day, and it already was by a certain degree. Just what the emperors wanted to avoid specifically was having chunks of the empire at some point taking off by themselves, and in part it would even happen in a later disgregative process, but it would be eventually mostly during the Comnenian age that much of the imperial power was actually based on the oligarchic one that was co-opted and brought in Constantinople. And this happened similarly to, I don't know, like before we mentioned the Sun King, it was a bit the same thing. If you have all the noblemen at Versailles, because that is the place where, again, there is the highest prestige is attached to, and it becomes like the central place where people prefer to abandon the province and not to cause problems there, and they just gravitate around your court and they try to win your favors, etc. You can effectively centralize, and that's how it happened there, by the way. But that's another story. For today, however, we stop it here. We will keep talking about Byzantine history and the Macedonians, and we'll see how things went also with Nicephorus Phocas, John Zimisces, and so on. For today, however, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.